Dinaway Magini Duke, greetings relatives. Diindiisi Indigeneity, Blue Jay is my Ojibwe name. Makinak Waju in Dunjiba, I'm from Turtle Mountain. Migizi in Dudame, I am Eagle Clan. My English name is Christine McCleave, and I'm the Executive Officer for the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, NABS for short.
Hi everybody, my name is Rose Miron and I am the Program Manager for NABS. I'm a little too tall for this. I've been at NABS since May and I graduated from this university, the University of Minnesota, with my Ph.D. in June 2018. I'm a non-native person, and just to give you a little bit of background, I know that we did bios in the beginning, but the area of research that I did when I was a PhD candidate was around archival collections that are shaped and created by Native people and how those collections can enable new narratives of Indigenous history that center Native perspectives and worldviews.
Great, so Rose and I are going to tag team a little bit. And we are also going to diverge a little bit from the two fabulous talks that we just heard, because we're not representing a university, but our work at the coalition is closely related to academia. I would just like to start, before we talk about our work, by drawing that connection for us all. In April, I was able to attend the opening of a Truth and History Dialogue Center at the University of British Columbia. And in Canada, they have had a National Truth and Reconciliation Commission that looked into the government and church-run residential schools that they had in that country. We have not had such a commission here in the US, and that is what our organization is attempting to facilitate, is either a commission, a national commission, or piecemeal truth-telling, healing, and reconciliation. Addressing the boarding school impacts here in the US. So the president of the university made an apology at the opening of that Truth and Reconciliation Center, and he said, quote, "Universities bear part of the responsibility for this history, not only for having trained many of the policymakers and administrators who operated the residential school system and doing so little to address the exclusion from higher education that the schools so effectively created, but also for tacitly accepting the silence surrounding it. In years past, even after the signing of human rights declarations and ethics agreements that followed World War II, university professors conducted research on the residential schools that exploited their deplorable conditions without attempting to change them. In modern times, the continuing failure to address this history has meant that the previous ways of thinking or of not thinking about the residential school system have remained largely intact. Failing to confront a heinous history, even if it is one that we did not cause, is to become complicit in its perpetuation. This is not a result that we as a university can accept." I was really glad that he made that speech and that he made that apology and that he drew those connections. And again, this was in Canada, but the same thing happened here in the US. So as I said, Rose and I are going to tag team, but I'll start out and tell you a little bit about our organization. We are a coalition of individuals, tribes, tribal organizations, and non-Native people and non-Native organizations who are basically trying to, like I said, recreate this Truth and Reconciliation Commission impacts and experience here in the US. We are a 501c3 nonprofit. We were started by the Native American Rights Fund in 2012. We're a staff of 2. This is it, folks. Our vision is Indigenous cultural sovereignty, and our mission is to lead in the pursuit of understanding and addressing the ongoing trauma created by the U.S. Indian boarding school policy. There were actually 2 federal policies that led to boarding schools. One was the Indian Civilization Fund Act, which was meant to administer healthcare, education, rations, all the things that were negotiated in the treaties when the tribal nations exchanged land for these other things. And so through that Civilization Fund, there was people who were basically corrupt and taking the funds or taking the rations for themselves. A few wars were started because they weren't giving the people the food. So the Dakota Wars is one example, and the Dakota 38+2 who were hanged is a result of that. But there was a later legislation in Grant's peace policy that said that churches could have access to these funds to help administer the civilization to the Indians. And that is how we ended up with federally funded church-run boarding schools. So we've had an independent researcher look into creating a list, which is in the publication that we handed to everybody. If you didn't get a copy, we have more copies. Dr. Denise Lajmeder found that there were over 357 boarding schools here in the U.S., and that list is still growing. It's the only complete list that has been compiled to date here in the U.S. We did a FOIA request to the government asking them for information about all the boarding schools, how many children went to those boarding schools, what happened to those children. In Canada, they know that about 6,000 children died or went missing in 150 of those schools. We don't know how many children died or went missing here in the U.S. Their response to our FOIA request was, and FOIA is Freedom of Information Act, their response was, we don't do research. So we're doing it on our own. The historical boarding school era, children were forcibly removed. It was legal for the Indian agents to withhold rations or to arrest parents if they didn't let their children go to schools. They were moved away from home so that they couldn't run away and return home. And they were, in often cases, beaten, starved, and abused. They were also used as forced labor to build the schools, sew the uniforms, grow the food, and then later they were farmed out through outing programs where they would be sent to live with neighboring families in the white community as cheap labor. So these are just some statistics we have. As we said, we don't have all the statistics, but it's estimated that by 1900, 20,000 children were in Indian boarding schools, and by 1925, over 60,000 were in boarding schools. A lot of the children died. We have a member of our coalition who has done his dissertation research, Preston McBride, on the death rates at just 4 of those schools. Carlisle was the first school, which my great-grandfather went to. And he also looked at Sherman Indian School, Chemawa, and Haskell. And Haskell's still open today as a university. It's evolved. They acknowledge their history there, but as we've heard, there's probably more work to be done about acknowledging the truth and history around these events. But his research shows that the majority of children who died from preventable diseases like tuberculosis. And in some cases, they would die of starvation or failure to thrive. So basically, they would get depressed and they would stop eating, and in some cases, suicide as well. All the boarding schools have cemeteries. So we're doing some work with tribes to look into repatriation. In Carlisle, they've started to repatriate the children who are buried there. At Chemawa, there's a cemetery of over 220 students who died at the school. And there's some initial research that's been done by Marcia Small with ground-penetrating radar that shows there are bodies buried on top of bodies, and also unmarked graves. So in Canada, they called it cultural genocide. And we've had this debate here in the US about, was this genocide or cultural genocide? And really, cultural genocide is genocide. So it does meet the UN definition of genocide. The impacts are not only on individuals, but on families, communities, and on tribal governance. I won't bother to read these, but it's prolific. There's, it's a ripple effect. And so a lot of what we see tribal communities and native communities, urban native communities, struggling with today are direct results of historical and intergenerational trauma. Also, we had Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart come and speak at our first national conference, which we just held a month ago in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And she talked about the term that she coined and the research that she did on historical trauma. And basically, the definition of historical trauma is not only what happened in past generations that will impact parenting and family dynamics that can be passed down, but also what happened to you during this lifetime. So anything that happened prior today is history. So any PTSD that I might have from previous experiences within this lifetime are also under that term historical trauma. There's also recent research on epigenetics by Dr. Rachel Yehuda at Mount Sinai Medical, and she basically found that children of Holocaust survivors have this genetic marker, which is actually low baseline cortisol levels, which can be passed on. So her next study was on combat veterans and also on pregnant women who were present at 9/11 in New York, and then also doing the study on those children who experienced the trauma in utero. And it's confirmed that whether you experienced the trauma yourself or it was your parents or grandparents, that you can still have that genetic marker. The research that she did also shows that through intensive therapy, behavioral therapy, that the genetic marker can be reversed. So that's a little, just like, in 10 seconds at 10,000 feet level, trying to give you the picture of what we're dealing with. It's a very large issue, but some of our strategies, since we don't have a class action lawsuit like they had in Canada, and since we don't have settlement funds to use towards a federal commission, we don't have court orders to bring all the records forward. We are doing the education, the research on our own, and advocating and supporting communities in their healing. So those are our strategies: education, advocacy, and healing. And so I'm going to let our program manager talk a little bit about our strategies and what we're doing.
Okay, so as Christine mentioned, one of the sort of biggest things that we don't have that Canada did was this Truth and Reconciliation Commission, right? And we're trying to replicate that in every way that we can, but also avoiding some of the missteps that they had. But one of the major parts of that commission was bringing forth all of the records of boarding schools. So churches, the federal government, who were all complicit in running residential schools in Canada, brought forth the records of those schools and really allowed research to occur about that history and really facilitated truth-telling. And that's something that's been really hard in the US because we just don't really know that much about the scope of boarding schools. So this is a graphic that we put together this year just to kind of show the majority of the records that we know of about boarding schools are in the National Archive and Record Administration locations. So there are 9 national archives that we've identified that we know have boarding school records, and they have the records of about 61 schools. The numbers on this map are a little outdated because we've actually identified 6 more schools since we created this graphic. So 357 boarding schools actually. We know where 61 of those schools' records are, which leaves more than 81% of the schools whose records are missing. We know that some of those are being held by the federal government still. We know a lot of them are being held by churches. But without them, there's only so much that we can do in terms of trying to really educate our nation about this history, put together statistics like how many children attended these schools, how many died, how many went missing. Those are all really crucial components in really illustrating why this issue is important and why there needs to be reconciliation and healing around that history. So we've started to think a lot about what records can tell us and why it's really important to bring forth these records. We need to know more about how the schools were run, what happened to the children in the schools. A lot of what we know right now is from anecdotal stories, which are super important, but if we can have the documents to back up some of these stories and this history, we can better communicate what really happened to these children and why it's affected communities, why it continues to affect Native communities today. There's really a lot of value in understanding the roots of the trauma that Christine talked about in terms of how Native communities are still reckoning with that history and with what happened to them and their ancestors. And so we really believe that records, illustrate the need for reconciliation, right? They tell people what happened, why there needs to be healing from this, and without them, we don't even know, what there is to apologize for and what the reconciliation is about. And so that's really one of the big initiatives that we're working towards, to the best of our ability without a class action lawsuit. I want to talk a little bit about some of what we've done so far to get the ball rolling on this. Right now, our website has a research database that holds just over 300 records and pieces of information about boarding schools. As you can see from this graphic, the top 3 rows there are like specific articles about boarding school, but we've also created entries for like the NARA records. So these are each of those national archives that I talked about on the previous slide. And even though those records aren't digitized, what we've done is basically created entries for each of those archives to show which schools' records they hold. So if somebody knew which school maybe their parent or their grandparent attended, they could still search that and figure out where those records are if they're held in a national archive. And so the goal of our database is to really bring together research that's being done about boarding schools and also give people information about where the records that we do know of can be found. As Christine mentioned, we also have, with the help of Dr. Denise Lajmadir, put together this comprehensive list of boarding schools by state. This list continues to grow, and it's something that's still in progress, but to our knowledge, this is the only complete list of boarding schools out there right now, again, because this research just hasn't been done, in part because the state of the records is so scattered and so many of them are still missing. It took Dr. Lajmadir years to put this together, and we're hoping, with the more records we can locate, the more comprehensive research like this we can do and really show how deeply boarding schools affected Native communities and the United States. The other thing that records is really important for is some of these other initiatives that we're working on around boarding school healing and justice. So for example, as Christine mentioned, one of the things we have been working on with tribes is the repatriation of children from boarding school cemeteries. So last November, we held the first tribal roundtable on repatriation from the Carlisle Cemetery for the 59 tribes who have children buried there. As you can imagine, really determining which students are buried in these cemeteries, where they're buried, is a lot easier when we have access to these records. Even with Carlisle, whose records are all public and at this point have actually been digitized through Dickinson College, there are still 14 graves that are marked unknown. And one of the first repatriations that took place, when they opened up a grave, it was actually found that it was mismarked. It was the wrong person, it was labeled incorrectly. And so this work has to be facilitated by more records and more information about these schools so that we can really help bring these children home to tribal communities. Another initiative that we're working on that's directly related to these records is a UN filing to identify children that went missing at boarding schools. In looking at some of the records that we do have access to, we've identified at least a dozen cases, only from looking at 4 schools, where children actually were taken into government custody in the boarding schools and then never returned home, but there's no record of them dying or being buried or really no information about where they went. And so we're seeing letters from parents asking where their children are and responses from the schools just kind of saying, we don't know what happened. And so again, this is something that Canada was able to sort of estimate based on the records that were brought forth. So they estimated that about 150,000 children attended boarding schools, and about 6,000 of those children died or went missing. Right now, we know that there were 357 plus Indian boarding schools in the US, but we don't have a sense of how many children attended those schools and how many died and went missing. The last number we have is really that 60,000 number from 1926, and boarding schools remained open, well, I should say assimilative boarding schools remained open through the 1970s, and there are actually 64 schools that are still open that aren't being used for assimilative purposes anymore, but we would guess that those numbers are actually a lot higher than what Canada has identified for their schools. As we go through this work, we know that these records contain really sensitive information, and a lot of the times, with the Carlisle records that were recently digitized by Dickinson College, there are people who, for the first time, are finding their family history in this digitized format, right? So for the first time, they are seeing these records of their ancestors. They're finding out what happened to their ancestors in a digital platform that's open to everybody. And so we want to think really carefully in terms of what happens if our long-term goal is to have these records brought forward, what happens to, what do we do with those records? How do we make them public while still considering the needs of tribal nations and what individual descendants and survivors of boarding school would want to happen with these records? So one of the long-term goals that we're working on is to create a comprehensive digital archive of boarding schools, right? So as I talked about with that graphic, with those archives being really spread out across the country, by creating a digital archive, our goal is really to bring those records together in a single place where people can search for them and really facilitate research. But again, one of the things that we're thinking about with that is how to think carefully about what should be digitized and what shouldn't. And so one of the things that we're thinking a lot about is a concept called data sovereignty, which is really all about reversing the paternalism of that non-Native institutions like archives and museums have had over Native historical materials for a long time, and thinking about how we can, how tribal nations can have more power and control over their own historical materials, whether that's in terms of what gets to be digitized and what doesn't, what's made public, what's accessible and what's not, how records are contextualized, how they're organized, and really thinking carefully about how can we create an archive that's really shaped and driven by Native people so that when these records are put in the context of each other, they create the conditions for new narratives about boarding schools to emerge, right? So what happens when we put all the records of these different labor outings together in one archive versus them being scattered all across the nation? What kind of new narratives can that tell us, especially when Native people have thought carefully about how those records are organized and how they're cataloged? And so that's something that we're developing. We actually recently assembled a research advisory council to help guide us in that work, and we're going to hopefully be drafting clear policies about digitization and thinking about this research within the coming months. So we want to end by thinking about what academia can do to help with this process. As this whole symposium has been about, there's a lot of colonial histories that come with academia, and a lot of those things continue with how research is done in and about Native communities. And so we really want to focus on thinking about how academic and non-academic researchers can work together to bring forth this history and really encourage truth-telling, specifically around the history of boarding schools. We're always looking for assistance with helping to assemble these records. So, I think, and I would say this goes generally for research with Native communities. I think it's always helpful if you're working with a Native community to think about what records you have access to that they might not, and think about how bringing those records forward can be helpful.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, just touching on what Rose just said about working with Native communities and academic and non-academic researchers. Mm-hmm. As I stand here next to Dr. Miron, and I do not have a doctorate degree, it's really important, especially in Native communities, to kind of decolonize that thinking. That Western paradigm of academia is, the gold standard. We have what we call our what do we call them? It's like, an indigenous Ph.D. Our people who are just our wisdom and knowledge keepers, who don't have some kind of certificate or degree that acknowledges all the wealth of information that they hold. So just, remembering that construct is very Western, and that in a lot of cases, in Native communities, it requires decolonizing your thinking around academia and research. One example of that is we're actually doing a study, the coalition and one of our board members, Sandy Whitehawk, who is the director of the First Nations Repatriation Institute. She does work with returning adoptees to their Native communities. We're doing a collaborative between the U of M, First Nations Repatriation, and the Boarding School Healing Coalition, and we're doing a research study to look at the impacts of boarding school, the connection to boarding school and subsequent later adoptions or foster care in families. And that's one good example of, Sandy doesn't have a degree, or she has a degree, but she doesn't have a doctorate degree. But she has been pivotal in framing this research and this survey that we're outlining. So, it's a good partnership, a good wedding of the Western and non-Western ways of researching.
Yeah, absolutely. So, just to build off the principles of data sovereignty, I think, again, something to always think about is really supporting Natives being in charge of their own materials and their own narratives. Something that I had to learn a lot when I was a doctoral candidate was really thinking about not just really going beyond listening to people and actually letting the Native people that I was working with lead the conversation. I think that in terms of, and I say this from somebody coming from academia, I think the norm has kind of become, if you're going to do work on Native communities, collaboration has become a little bit more normalized. But I think that the dynamic there is still that, academics go into Native communities and say, this is what I'm doing, do you approve? And I think really actually going beyond that to say, really going into communities and saying, what are your interests? How can I be helpful? Can I be helpful at all? And I think that is really something that really needs to continue to change in academia. And I think that, we all need to do a lot more work around that. And so, as Christine said, like the boundaries between academia and non-academia are continuing to blur. And I think that whether you're a researcher with a Ph.D. or one without, somebody who has just a lot of knowledge, I think that still is just an important principle to go by. So
absolutely. Yeah. Anything else on this one?
No, I don't think so. So to close out, we encourage you all to learn more about us, help us spread the word about our initiative. We passed out copies of our publication to most people in the room at the beginning, but there are additional copies outside on the table. Otherwise, we have a ton up here too if you didn't get one. We encourage you to follow us on social media. Again, help us get the word out about this issue. Thank you.
Absolutely.